This program was sponsored by the Jessie and John Danz Fund. Since 1962, these lectures have been a forum for distinguished scholars of national and international reputation who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe.
I'm Michael Halleran, the Divisional Dean of Arts and Humanities here at the university, and also co-chair of the Danz Lectureship Committee, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to tonight's lecture. We are here tonight because of the very generous and foresighted gift made by John Danz upon his death. Over 40 years ago, he established this lectureship. John Danz had come to Seattle in the early 1900s and was a very successful businessman. He was best known, perhaps, for his chain of what was then fairly novel movie theaters. He was a self-educated man and read very widely. He was fascinated by scientific discovery and also by the philosophy of humanism. In creating this endowment, his goal was to bring to the University of Washington distinguished men and women who, and I quote, have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe. A tall order, but one which many speakers over the last 40 years have accomplished very well on our campus. John Danz's wife, Jessie, shared in his vision and augmented the gift upon her death. I'd like you all to take a moment to thank or to express your appreciation for the Danz family, which now in this current generation continues to be very generous in its support of the university, and most recently has established courses in the humanities, Danz courses taught through our Simpson Center for the Humanities. Thank you. Tonight's speaker will be introduced by Kathleen Woodward, who is a professor of English and also the director of our Walter Chapin Simpson Center for the Humanities. Kathy?
Hi, good evening. This past September, the Graduate School and the Simpson Center for the Humanities sponsored an institute for doctoral students in the public humanities. It was the first one of its kind in the country, and its purpose was to inspire our students, our doctoral students, the future faculty of our country, to imagine ways that they could translate their research into domains that would take them beyond the academy, beyond a strictly academic sphere, to make their research really into public work. I was absolutely proud of this institute. I hope it will continue. And this brings me to Louis Menand. Now, why does it? Because he is simply for us exemplary as a public scholar and a public intellectual. Exemplary. He's a professor of English at Harvard University. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker, and I learned earlier this evening that in fact, if you're a staff writer for The New Yorker, you're not allowed to work for any other magazine. So he did write before for the New York Review of Books, for Art Forum, for the New Republic, but for right now, that's on hold. He's the author of, among many other books, the brilliant Pulitzer Prize winning The Metaphysical Club, The Story of Ideas in America. You know about that book. He's also the author of a collection of essays entitled American Studies. It appeared last year, and it has essays in it ranging from focus on Maya Lin, Richard Wright, and Pauline Kael, to the educator James Conant, and the intertwining of the lives of Jerry Falwell and Larry Flint, how they come together at a peculiar moment in American history. I'm in admiration of his many gifts, the incisiveness of his observations and the judiciousness of his temperament, his expansive curiosity, and the sheer scope of his work. He has a capacity to really pay remarkable attention to people and to capture their passions and their personalities. I'm thinking, for example, of a wonderful essay on Al Gore, which is entitled The Mind of Al Gore, and he remarks that Al Gore's affect is rectilinear. Very interesting. I'm in admiration of his own leavening wit and his bemused sense of humor, and I really want you to read his essay on The New Yorker. I'm in admiration of the clarity of his writing and the deftness with which he imparts insights that are profound, even as he articulates them with apparent ease. Here is one. Emotions that mean something, he writes, emotions that mean something should somehow surprise you. That seems to me just right. He's working on a book on the intellectual history of the Cold War, and his subject for us this evening is, Do Movies Have Rights? Here he is, Louis Menand.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honor for me to be asked to give this lecture. I'd like to thank Kathy Woodward, Dick Dunn of the English department for extending the invitation to give the lecture, and also to thank Yvette Moy for making it a great pleasure to be here for a couple of days. Do movies have rights? Obviously not. What a stupid question. Asking whether movies have rights is like asking whether guns have rights. Movies don't have rights. People have rights. Let's try again. Do people have a right to the movies? The answer to that question is that for the first half century of motion pictures in America, they did not. The Constitution of the United States did not cast its magic cloak over Hollywood and its products. The movies were out there in the constitutional cold, along with cars and antidepressants and donuts. That is just another category of manufactured goods subject to regulation in the name of public health. I'm going to tell the story tonight of the transformation of the movies from something like cars and antidepressants into something like poems and newspapers. Before I start telling the story, I want to ask you to keep a couple things in mind about what we're talking about when we talk about rights. The first is that a legal right or a constitutional right is the ace in the legal deck. It trumps every other card. On the other hand, a pair of twos can beat it. Expression requires resources. No law prevents other people from denying resources to those whose expressions they wish to suppress. And everybody's seen a recent example of this in the case of this docudrama that CBS pulled about the Reagans. A right is not worth very much if the cost of exercising it is made too high. And the second idea, I just want to preface the discussion by mentioning, is that rights in our society are conceived of as things owned by individuals, not as things owned by groups. Persons are rights bearers, but communities are not. But rights are individual privileges created by society for the good of society, not for the good of the individual. We tend to think of liberty as the natural state and coercion as something that's the result of social forces. But the opposite is the case. Coercion is the natural state. It's society that creates and maintains the space for liberty. In the end, if the harm to the many is felt to outweigh the good to the few, the many will ultimately prevail. In a majoritarian society, the majority generally gets its way. The Birth of a Nation previewed in Riverside, California on January 1st and 2nd, 1915. And then in Los Angeles, February 8th. The movie was not called The Birth of a Nation at those screenings. It was called The Klansman, after the well-known and very successful play by the Reverend Thomas Dixon. The play was based on two of the novels in Dixon's so-called Reconstruction trilogy. The novels are called The Leopard Spots and The Klansman. It was Thomas Dixon himself who, after seeing the movie in Los Angeles, decided on the name change. He's supposed to have said after the screening, "The picture is better than the book. The picture is like The Birth of a Nation." The movie was immediately protested by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP had been formed in 1909, and by 1915, the year The Birth of a Nation came out, it had 6,000 members. The NAACP succeeded in getting an injunction closing the first showing in Los Angeles on February 8th, but it did not get a permanent injunction, and the movie was shown in the evening of February 8th to a capacity audience of 2,500 people. It was a phenomenal success. In 1915, the year the movie came out, was the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. The California branch of the NAACP retained Clarence Darrow to represent it in a suit to prevent the movie from being shown in Los Angeles, but the suit went nowhere. The organization did not give up. It waged a national legal campaign to ban the movie completely. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote several editorials in the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, on the subject. Du Bois called it a slanderous film. Quote, "The Negro is represented either as an ignorant fool, a vicious racist, a venal and unscrupulous politician, or a faithful but doddering idiot," end quote. The NAACP advised Southern blacks not to demonstrate against the birth of a nation for fear of their own safety. But in northern cities, the organization protested relentlessly. In New York City, where the movie, now renamed The Birth of a Nation, had its world premiere on March 3rd, the NAACP appealed to city officials to refuse to grant the theater a license to show the movie. It was unsuccessful in this, although it did cause a disruption at the theater the night it opened. The movie ended up playing in New York City for 48 weeks, during which more than 1 million people saw it. And they paid what was regarded at the time as a ridiculously high premium price of $2 a ticket. In Boston, the local NAACP chapter demonstrated against the movie and published several pamphlets, including one called A Vicious Lie, which reprinted condemnations of the film by prominent civic and political figures. Thomas Dixon and the movie's director, D.W. Griffith, offered the white president of the Boston NAACP, a man named Moorfield Story, $10,000 if he could find a single historical inaccuracy in the movie. Story asked them what black lieutenant governor, as is shown in the film, had ever bound and gagged a white woman. He does not seem to have received his $10,000. The NAACP was unable to close the movie down in Boston, but it did persuade the city to create a board of censorship. The movie was banned in Minneapolis by the mayor of the city, in Ohio by order of the governor, and in Newark, St. Paul, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, among other cities. Many of these actions were overturned, and the movie was permitted to be shown. In Minneapolis, the state Supreme Court upheld the right of the mayor to ban the movie, but the mayor reversed his decision anyway. The Birth of a Nation was not shown in Ohio, however, until 1956. The NAACP was created for the purpose of agitating actively on African American issues, and the Birth of a Nation was an ideal cause because it focused attention on what Du Bois regarded as the fatal weakness in Booker T. Washington's approach, which was the acceptance of a subservient status for African Americans and of the demeaning stereotypes by which that status was culturally reinforced. The Birth of a Nation became a staple of NAACP protest, and it had many occasions because The Birth of a Nation was re-released regularly in the 1920s, which was also the peak period of the Second Ku Klux Klan, which had been started in 1915 by an ex-minister named William J. Simmons, who had been inspired by Dixon's novels and by Griffith's movie. A sound version of The Birth of a Nation was released in 1930, again over NAACP protests. Between 1915 and 1973, the NAACP challenged screenings of The Birth of a Nation more than 120 times. There were other protesters as well. Jane Addams, who attended a special screening of The Birth of a Nation in New York a week after it opened, criticized the movie as inaccurate and unfair. And Booker T. Washington himself wrote letters to newspapers attacking the film. These protests did have two effects. The first was they did change the movie itself. The version of The Birth of a Nation that we see today is not the version that audiences saw in Riverside, California in January 1915, or even in New York City 2 months later. Scenes of white women being abducted by blacks in the riot scene in the second half of the movie were cut. An epilogue showing a letter Lincoln had written stating that he did not believe in racial equality was deleted. An explicit lynching scene was removed. The so-called Gus scene, in which the actor Walter Long in blackface chases Mae Marsh through the woods, was toned down, in part by adding an intertitle that reads, "I'm not going to hurt you, Missy." In Boston, the entire Gus episode was cut from the picture. And the original ending of the movie showed blacks being deported to Africa from New York Harbor, and the scene was introduced with the intertitle, "Lincoln's Solution." This entire scene was cut. The second effect of the protest was to produce counter-reactions on the part of the filmmakers. It's an indication of the context within which the movie was received that relatively little was said about Griffith. The person identified as the author of The Birth of a Nation was Thomas Dixon. And it was Dixon, actually, who campaigned most actively on its behalf. He tended to speak of it as his movie. And he had, in fact, a substantial financial stake in the picture. Dixon had tried to sell the movie rights to his novel for $25,000. And this was almost a quarter of the entire budget for the movie. And the producers refused the $25,000 request, and he accepted instead $2,000 in what we call points, that is, percentage of the profits. And it was the smartest thing he ever did, because he ended up getting $1 million from the picture. The agitation against the movie in California when it first opened made Dixon very nervous, so he approached the White House to seek the endorsement of the president. Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner to be elected to the presidency since the Civil War, and he and Dixon were old friends. They had been graduate students at Johns Hopkins University together. Wilson was not hostile to the view of Reconstruction presented in The Birth of a Nation. In fact, some passages from his popular history of the United States are used in the film as intertitles. Wilson had also, as president, segregated the federal workforce for the first time, separating white workers from black workers in government offices and cafeterias. And he allowed Dixon to use the phrase that he's supposed to have uttered after seeing the film in the White House as a blurb. And the phrase, of course, is, "It is history written with lightning." After his success with the White House, Dixon approached the Supreme Court, where he appealed to the Chief Justice, Edward White. Now, White was a formidable figure. He had never been to the movies in his life, he told Dixon, and he had no use for them. But when Dixon explained that The Birth of a Nation told the true story of the Ku Klux Klan, White changed his mind, and he arranged a screening for the justices of the court. The reason, he explained to Dixon, was that he had once been a member of the Ku Klux Klan himself in Louisiana after the Civil War. Dixon's argument against critics of the movie was that the movie was true history, and the truth is always a defense against a charge of libel. The Birth of a Nation, Dixon said, quote, "expresses the passionate faith of the entire white population of the South. If I am wrong, they are wrong. The number of white people in the South who differ from my views of the history of Reconstruction could be housed on a half-acre lot," end quote. Dixon also argued that the purpose of the movie was to prevent interracial marriage by making black men appear odious to white women. This had always been the basis of Dixon's racism, and in the case of the controversy over The Birth of a Nation, he had the ideal opponent because revocation of the laws against racial intermarriage was a plank of the NAACP's platform. Griffith, for his part, adopted a different strategy. Griffith argued that the movie should be immune from censorship on grounds that it was both a form of opinion, protected under the Constitution, and a form of artistic and moral instruction, like Shakespeare and the Bible. In 1916, Griffith published a pamphlet called The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, in which he objected to the assumption that there was a legal difference between a movie and a work of literature. He argued that people like Jane Addams, who objected to movies as corrupters of youth, which Jane Addams was on record as doing, were elitists. After all, people like movies. By 1916, the year that Griffith wrote his pamphlet, movies were the fourth largest industry in the United States. They were doing over $300 million worth of business a year. Griffith said, well, once knowledge was purveyed in boring books, which only a few people had access to. But the movies brought knowledge and enlightenment to millions. Plus, they were fun. On February 23, 1915, which is 4 days after the justices had had their special screening of The Birth of a Nation, the Supreme Court handed down an opinion in a case called Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio. The Mutual Film Corporation was a film distribution company founded by a man who had one of the most spectacular peripeteias in Hollywood history. The man's name was Harry Aiken, and without him, The Birth of a Nation would almost certainly never have been made. Aiken grew up on a farm in Waukesha, Wisconsin. In 1905, he and his brother Roy, who was also his lifelong business partner, borrowed $100 from a friend and started a chain of Nickelodeons in Chicago. 9 years later, by 1914, the Aikens owned or had a controlling interest in two movie production companies, Majestic and Reliance, a foreign distributorship called Western Import Limited, and a distribution company, Mutual Production Company. They were among the first filmmakers to entice Wall Street bankers to invest in movie production, and they were among the first to advertise their movies in magazines. The Aikens had on their payrolls at one time or another Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Lillian and Dorothy Gish, Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, Max Sennett, and D.W. Griffith. They also employed the future director, Raoul Walsh, who was then an actor, and you may know that he plays the character of John Wilkes Booth in The Birth of a Nation. The Aiken brothers lived together in a lavish New York City apartment with an English butler. They were the distributors and chief financial backers of The Birth of a Nation. But by 1918, 3 years after the movie came out, they were broke and back on the farm in Wisconsin, where they spent the rest of their lives dreaming of their big Hollywood comeback. The reason for the Aikens' business failure was the same as the reason for their success, which is that they were gamblers. When Griffith approached them to finance The Birth of a Nation, a typical movie was 2 to 4 reels long and cost between $2,000 and $10,000 to make. The Birth of a Nation is 12 reels, and its budget was $110,000. No one but the Aikens were willing to fund it. In fact, Harry Aiken could not persuade the boards of either of his companies, Majestic or Mutual, to back the picture. The boards told him that they preferred to stick to 4-reelers. So Aiken raised the money himself, and he created a new company called the Epic Producing Corporation to distribute the movie. And the Aikens personally invested $59,000 in the picture. The board of Mutual, which had refused to fund the movie, responded by firing Harry Aiken as the president. So he proceeded to create another company called Triangle Film, and that was the beginning of his downfall. He had the bright idea, Harry Aiken, of signing Broadway stage actors at enormous salaries to come to Hollywood and perform in his films. What he discovered is that stage actors tend to be older people, and their faces look fine from the 10th row, but the movie camera is not kind to them. He lost his company, he lost his studio in Culver City, and he lost his shirt. He was a mogul for a minute. On the other hand, it's a minute longer than the rest of us are likely to be a mogul. When The Birth of a Nation came out, Mutual, Harry Aiken's old company that had fired him, was in the midst of litigation against several states, including Ohio, that required movies and other public entertainments, theatrical productions, and so forth, to be licensed by a special board before they could be put on. Mutual's suit against the Ohio board was called the Industrial Commission, went to the Supreme Court. Now, laws requiring the licensing of public entertainments have been on the books in the United States forever. Producers of those entertainments had sued licensing boards in the past to recover the right to put on their productions when they'd been denied a license. What made the Mutual case different was the basis of the company's legal claim. Mutual asserted that the Ohio licensing law was a violation of its freedom of speech under the Ohio Constitution. You have to remember that in 1915 there was no extension of federal rights to states. The Bill of Rights was not incorporated into state law, so they sued on the basis of the guarantee of freedom of speech in the Ohio Constitution. It was the first case in American law involving movie censorship to be argued on free speech grounds. This originality did not do Mutual any good. The Supreme Court was unanimous in holding that a movie is not speech. And the language of the court's opinion is interesting. Quote, "The exhibition of moving pictures is a business pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit, like other spectacles, not to be regarded by the Ohio Constitution as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion. Movies are mere representations of events, of ideas and sentiments published and known. Vivid, useful, entertaining, no doubt, but capable of evil, having power for it, the greater because of their attractiveness and manner of exhibition. It was this capability and power, and it may be an experience of them, that induced the state of Ohio to require censorship before exhibition. We cannot regard this as beyond the power of government," end quote. Now, the logic is important. Mutual had argued that movies are speech and therefore shielded from the kind of prior restraint represented by this Ohio licensing requirement by the Constitution. It also argued that movies are property. It's a product, after all, created by a business, and therefore they're shielded from interference from the state by the Contracts Clause of the Constitution. Now, Mutual was trying to catch the court on a fork. If the court holds that movies are expression, then Mutual's products are protected from prior restraint by the Ohio Constitution. If, on the other hand, it holds that movies are a business, then those products are protected by the Contracts Clause of the United States Constitution. In order to hold that the movies are not speech, the court had to find that they have no original power of expression, which is exactly what the court did say. The court said movies are not original, they're just representations of things that have already been known and said. This leaves the aesthetic properties of the medium, their emotional force, as the defining element. And now the court found that that aesthetic power, that emotional force that movies have, is potent enough to engage the legitimate exercise of the state's police power. In other words, the court justified the obstruction of the use of private property by the claim that the public good and public safety required it, because the police power can trump the Contracts Clause. So now you can see the constitutional basis for the NAACP's protests and the reason why Dixon went out of his way to seek the approbation of the President and the Supreme Court. In 1915, the Constitution did not protect movies from censorship. Censorship, in fact, was the norm, and the possibility that the birth of a nation might be suppressed was perfectly real. There was nothing in the law to prevent that from happening. In 1914, the year before The Birth of a Nation was released, the National Board of Censors, whose rulings were followed by many of these state censoring agencies, reviewed 5,700 films. It required changes in almost 10% of them, over 500 movies, and it condemned 79 films completely. Even after these were revised and resubmitted, 27 were completely banned anyway. The National Board of Censors had approved The Birth of a Nation, though, on a split vote. And by 1915, the board was reviewing every film made in the United States before it could be shown and charged a fee for every film it reviewed, as did all local censorship boards. It's estimated that the total cost to filmmakers for dealing with these boards across the country was $500,000 a year. That was the motivation for Mutual's lawsuit. The cost of submitting the prints to the censorship boards, which normally charged $1 a reel to review the movies, and the interference that was created in plans for advertising movies by having to go up before boards in separate jurisdictions. Mutual did not think that any of its movies were objectionable or indecent. who was perfectly willing to take the chance that after the movie was exhibited, it would be found in violation of decency statutes. In fact, Harry Aiken was a religious man, and he had refused to distribute movies that he considered unclean. The company just wanted to avoid the expense of submitting these prints and waiting for the vetting to take place. And that's why they objected to the licensing process as an exercise in prior restraint. They had no intention of distributing dirty pictures. So we find a progressive group we assume to be devoted to the cause of civil liberties, the NAACP, calling for censorship. And a commercial entity we assume to be indifferent to those liberties, the Mutual Film Corporation, attempting to broaden the protections of the First Amendment. This seems anomalous to us, but it reflects the status that the idea of rights had around the time of the First World War, when rights talk was understood by most people to be inherently conservative. Rights were invoked by businesses and by courts in order to claim protection from regulation by the state. That's what Mutual was doing. Progressives, like the NAACP, were hostile to rights talk because they were hostile to the argument that private commercial activities that affected the public were immune from public regulation and intervention. The chief constitutional wedge that was available to be driven into the law protecting private corporations was the police power, the power to regulate things for the purpose of public safety and welfare. And that's the power cited by the court in Mutual versus Ohio, and it's the power that was regularly invoked by the NAACP in its protests against the birth of a nation. The NAACP tried to persuade courts and governments that the public peace would be disrupted if the film was exhibited in its intended form. And as we've seen in a few places, that argument was successful. It wasn't so much sensitivity towards African Americans that prompted white mayors and governors to ban or censor The Birth of a Nation. It was the fear that the movie might incite mob violence. And The Birth of a Nation, after all, is, from first to last, a justification for vigilantism. The effects of the controversy over The Birth of a Nation and the Mutual decision in the same year were long-lasting. The Mutual decision was one of the things that led to the establishment of the Hays Office in 1921, which was an effort by Hollywood to practice self-censorship and thus avoid the problem of state regulation altogether. And for many years, that strategy worked. The virus that finally destroyed it came, as so many viruses do, from overseas. Mutual was the law of the land for 37 years, until 1952. The case that overturned it and that led the Supreme Court to declare movies eligible for First Amendment protection is known as the Miracle case. The key figure in this story is another distributor, a man named Joseph Burston. Burston was a Polish immigrant who came to New York City in 1921 when he was 20. He worked first in the diamond business and then as a press agent for the Yiddish Theater in New York. In the 1930s, Burston became partners with the publicity director for Paramount, a man named Arthur Mayer, and they opened the first distribution company in America that dealt exclusively with foreign films. Burston and Mayer managed what used to be called art houses, or were later known as repertory houses, in large cities around the country. Burston was a smart businessman, but he also knew something about the movies. After the Second World War, he and his partner, Arthur Mayer, brought to the United States, among other European films, the classics of Italian neorealism, Open City, Paisan, Shoeshine, and The Bicycle Thief. Part of the appeal that European movies had in those days was that they were what we would call today unrated. That is, they didn't have to be submitted to the Motion Picture Association's internal censorship procedures for approval under the production code because they were not produced by companies that were members of the MPAA. Foreign films therefore sort of automatically acquired an aura of licentiousness that was often completely unmerited. Theater owners were not under the illusion that people came to see Italian movies because of their sensitive portrayal of the human condition. In Chicago, ads for De Sica's The Bicycle Thief read, "Uncut. See The Bicycle Thief in its entirety without a single censorship snip." And the ad for Rossellini's Open City read, "Adults only. Savage orgy of lust." And of course, there's no sex in either movie. Now, the same is true of The Miracle. The Miracle was a Roberto Rossellini movie. It's 40 minutes long. It had been a commercial flop in Italy, where audiences found it boring. The story was written by Federico Fellini, and it concerns a homeless and mentally defective Italian woman, played by Anna Magnani, who meets a wanderer who's dressed in a cast-off American Army uniform. And the wanderer was played in the movie by Fellini. The homeless woman, who's deranged, believes that the wanderer is St. Joseph, the father of Christ. Sensing an opportunity, the wanderer gets the Magnani character drunk and has sex with her entirely off camera. The woman becomes pregnant. Having no memory of the sex, and she was drunk at the time, she imagines that she has been immaculately impregnated. The townspeople in this little village in Italy mock her savagely, and they crown her with a wash bowl for a halo, and she flees the town. At the end of the film, she gives birth in an abandoned church. Now, there's nothing remotely titillating about this movie. Anna Magnani is made into a gibbering, unkempt bag lady, and the wanderer and the townspeople are malign and abusive. There's very little in the movie that we would call dialogue, and the ending is unpleasant and disturbing. The Miracle is not a movie about religious hypocrisy. It's a movie about the wickedness of a world without spirituality. Rossellini called the film pro-Catholic. He said, quote, "It was an absolutely Catholic work," which may be taking things a little too far, but it's certainly not a satire of religion. This proved to be a distinction too fine for American audiences. In 1950, when The Miracle came to the United States, 6 states and about 200 municipalities had censorship boards whose approval was required to exhibit a film. And the industry by that point was paying about $1.8 million a year in fees and other costs to comply with these licensing requirements, although by 1950 this was an industry that was grossing $1.2 billion a year. Joseph Burston did apply for and did receive a license to exhibit The Miracle from the New York State Censorship Board, which was part of the Motion Picture Division of the state's Department of Education, which was an agency governed by the New York Board of Regents. In 1950, after he got his license, Burston combined the Rossellini movie with short movies by Jean Renoir and Maurice Pagnol, and he released all 3 of them under the title Ways of Love. Ways of Love opened at the Paris Theater in Manhattan on December 12, 1950. In 1950, the Paris was the leading venue in New York City, and therefore in the country, for foreign films. And the theater is still there. It's on 58th Street, just off Fifth Avenue across from the plaza. At some point within the next 2 weeks of the movie opening, it was seen by a man named Edward T. McCaffrey. Mr. McCaffrey happened to be the Commissioner of Licenses in the city of New York, a political appointee who supervised the issuance of licenses for the 77 activities then requiring one in the city. I believe the number of activities that now require a license to be practiced in New York City is 700. McCaffrey found The Miracle, quote, officially and personally blasphemous, end quote, as he put it in a letter that he wrote to the owner of the Paris Theater. And he took it upon himself unilaterally to suspend the theater's license. McCaffrey had received no complaints from anyone else, and he had consulted no committees. He told reporters that, quote, officially as a representative of the city government, I felt that there were hundreds of thousands of citizens whose religious beliefs were assaulted by the picture, end quote. Now, one assumes that, based on his name, that Mr. McCaffrey was himself of Irish Catholic descent, and he had been appointed to his post as Commissioner of Licenses by the mayor of New York City, whose name was Vincent Impellitteri. Mayor Impellitteri stayed out of the controversy on the time-honored New York principle that since the state never pays attention to a city problem, the city should pay no attention to anything that could possibly be made into a state problem. It was the state of New York that licensed movies, not the city, and it was the state's politicians whose careers were in the ethnic ringer. The Catholic Church's Board of Movie Censorship, the Legion of Decency, picked up the license commissioner's cue, and they condemned The Miracle as sacrilegious, which is the first movie the Legion of Decency ever condemned on those grounds. Joseph Burston then went to court, and he did not have much trouble getting Commissioner McCaffrey's order rescinded on the grounds that it obviously had been issued without due process. After all, the movie had received a license from the agency that was empowered to grant or withhold such license. As the flames were fed by this controversy, the Paris theater started selling out. It was so crowded sometimes that there were standees. Then the New York City Fire Department started making it a habit of closing the theater down whenever, in its estimation, the crowd exceeded the legal capacity in violation of the fire code. This had not been something the New York City Fire Department had been very concerned about in the past. But the miracle became a cause célèbre, and Burstyn made a lot of money. He needed it because the protesters were not done. Shortly after Burstyn won his restraining order, the head of the Catholic Archdiocese in New York, Francis Cardinal Spellman, weighed in. On January 7th, 1951, Spellman issued a statement, read at all Masses in St. Patrick's Cathedral, in which he called on Catholics to boycott the miracle, a movie he called, quote, vile and harmful, end quote. He said the movie was blasphemous, it disrespected Italian womanhood, and it made people who saw it vulnerable to communism. He warned, quote, divide and conquer is the technique of the greatest enemy of civilization, atheistic communism. God forbid that these producers of racial religious mockery should divide and demoralize Americans so that the minions of Moscow might enslave this land of liberty, end quote. Interestingly, the company that distributed Western movies to Soviet bloc companies refused to distribute The Miracle on grounds that it was pro-Catholic propaganda. By the time the Cardinal issued his proclamation in January 1951, 100,000 people had bought tickets to see The Miracle at the Paris Theater. The theater was enjoying its highest grosses ever, despite the presence, or perhaps because of the presence, of Catholic picketers outside who carried signs that read, "This is the kind of picture the communists want," and "Don't be a communist, all the communists are inside." Now, these protests may seem misguided or examples of self-righteousness, but if you think of the Catholics who picketed The Miracle, on the analogy of the African Americans who protested the birth of a nation, you can sympathize with the motivation. It wasn't that they couldn't stomach the image of Anna Magnani being made pregnant by Federico Fellini in army boots. It was because they thought that the whole story of seduction and torment in an Italian village was bad for Catholics, which was a group still subject to discrimination. It didn't matter so much what Rossellini's message was. He'd represented Italians as primitive and vicious, and he made Catholicism seem a superstition. The Catholic protests stirred the New York State Board of Regents to action, and it's not hard to see why. The target of the protests ultimately was the agency that had licensed The Miracle for distribution in the first place, the Motion Picture Division of the Department of Education. The department was a government agency. There were 1.25 million Catholics in New York, and Catholics vote, often as a bloc. There was another reason propelling the attacks on The Miracle, and that was because Rossellini had famously seduced Ingrid Bergman, a great Hollywood star. Bergman was not a Catholic, of course. She was Swedish, but she was an honorary Catholic because she had played Joan of Arc. And in the movie The Bells of St. Mary's, she had played a nun. When she became involved with Rossellini, she abandoned her husband, Dr. Peter Lindstrom, and she and Rossellini had a child, Robertino, out of wedlock. Robertino was born in 1950, the same year that The Miracle opened in New York. This made Ingrid Bergman a pariah in America, and she was actually denounced on the floor of the United States Senate as, quote, Hollywood's apostle of degradation, end quote. Rossellini was also suspected by many people in the United States of being a communist sympathizer, which was not unusual in post-war Italy, but of course was anathema to Americans in the early years of the Cold War. And these facts help to explain why a movie as bleak and unstimulating, not to say boring, as The Miracle could inspire such vehement opposition from official figures. And as is often true in cases like these, as was true, for example, in the case later on of the protests against Martin Scorsese's adaptation of The Last Temptation of Christ, most of the people who condemned the movie had never seen it. The New York State Board of Regents wasted little time in unanimously rescinding the license granted to Burstyn to distribute The Miracle on grounds that the movie was sacrilegious, which is actually listed as a bannable category under the statute authorizing the licensing board. Burstyn took his case to the state courts, all of which refused to reverse the Regents' action. In 1952, it came before the United States Supreme Court, in the case of Burston against Wilson. On May 26, 1952, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that New York's ban of the miracle was an exercise of prior restraint in violation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Mutual against Ohio was overturned, and the movies, for the first time, became a constitutionally protected form of expression. According to the court's opinion, quote, movies are a significant medium for the communication of ideas. The importance of motion pictures as an organ of public opinion is not lessened by the fact that they are designed to entertain as well as inform, end quote. And this, you'll remember, is precisely the argument that D.W. Griffith had made in his pamphlet, The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, back in 1916. The ruling in the Miracle case was a narrow one, as it often is in cases like that. The court did not say states could never ban or censor movies. It only said that they could not do so by finding them sacrilegious, since that standard was vague and subjective. But as often happens with narrow rulings, the Miracle decision was interpreted by subsequent courts to prohibit censorship of movies on any ground except obscenity. Burston against Wilson became a terrible, swift sword for striking down movie censorship rulings. All the movie had to do to defy a licensing board was to assert that it expressed an idea. Thus, in 1959, the Supreme Court unanimously struck down New York State's refusal to license the movie version of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Lady Chatterley had not been banned because of the sex scenes, the court said. It was banned because it expressed an idea that the state of New York did not like. The idea, as Justice Potter Stewart put it in his opinion, the idea was that, quote, adultery under certain circumstances may be proper behavior, end quote. Joseph Burston spent between $55,000 and $75,000 of his own money to win his case against New York State. On the other hand, it was fully tax deductible as a business expense. The American film industry was not interested in getting involved in his suit at all. In fact, Burston was discouraged by people in Hollywood from pursuing a legal avenue at all. And the reason is not hard to understand. Since the Motion Picture Association had its own censorship regime in place, almost all the movies subjected to government censorship were foreign movies, in other words, the competition. No one in Hollywood lost any sleep over the thought that some French or Italian import might lose its license for American exhibition. That meant one less adults-only foreign film for American movie audiences to spend their discretionary entertainment dollars on. After the ruling, the Miracle reopened in New York City, this time in 10 theaters, and the ads read, "The world's most talked about movie, see for yourself the original, uncut version, exactly as it was approved by the United States Supreme Court." Still, in Chicago, where the Miracle had been banned as irreligious, it was reviewed again, and this time it was banned as obscene. The Miracle was not seen in Chicago until 1957. By then, Joseph Burston was dead. In 1953, a year after the Burston against Wilson decision, he was on his way to Europe and suffered a heart attack on the plane. 3 years later, Ingrid Bergman was back in Hollywood, and she was legally separated from Roberto Rossellini in 1957. In 1954, 2 years after the Miracle decision, the phone rang in the Aikens house in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The man on the phone was named Phil Ryan. Phil Ryan told Harry Aiken that he represented a syndicate of investors that wanted to produce a remake of The Birth of a Nation. This was the phone call Harry Aiken had been waiting for 40 years. He was still the president of Epic Producing Corporation, a business whose sole function was to retain the rights to The Birth of a Nation. Aiken had already tried to get Griffith and Dixon to collaborate on a remake back in the 1930s. By then, Griffith and Dixon were both broken and broke, and they were thrilled by the prospect of more financial raindrops falling on their heads. But Griffith wanted $800,000 to make the movie, and Aiken could only raise about $100,000. Dixon died in 1946. Griffith died 2 years later. In 1954, when he got this phone call, Aiken was in his 70s, but he was ready to roll. He sold Ryan's investors, it was a group headed by a financier named Ted Thal, an option on The Birth of a Nation, and a remake was actually announced in the trade papers, but the money was never there and the deal fell through. 2 years later, Aiken died. Where might movie censorship have gone after the Miracle case? There was another road, but history did not go down it. That road appears in a case that was decided in the same term as Burson versus Wilson, and that's the case of Beauharnais versus Illinois. Joseph Beauharnais was the leader of an outfit called the White Circle League of America, Incorporated. He opposed housing desegregation in Chicago and was convicted by an Illinois court for distributing leaflets condemning what he called the mongrelization of the white race by African Americans, whom he accused of aggression, rape, robbery, drug use, and other antisocial behavior. Supreme Court, in an opinion by Felix Frankfurter, upheld the Illinois conviction on the theory that Beauharnais had committed the crime of what we now call group libel, essentially an extension of the concept of individual libel to groups, in this case, African Americans. Frankfurter said that because of its history of violent racial conflict, it was reasonable for the state of Illinois to prosecute Beauharnais in the name of public safety. This had been the logic for the censors of The Birth of a Nation and of the Supreme Court in the Mutual decision back in 1915. But the Beauharnais decision has not stood up. In 1962, in the case of New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court held that the Times was not libelous for running an advertisement that made accusations against certain white sheriffs in Montgomery, Alabama, at the time of civil rights protests there, even though some of those accusations were false. The court maintained that in the interest of fostering robust public debate, public figures such as sheriffs are not protected by libel laws. Robust public debate is what the First Amendment was presumably intended to protect, and plainly Joseph Beauharnais' leaflets fall into that category. So does Thomas Dixon's movie. What makes the Beauharnais and Mutual arguments hard to accept today is the general sentiment that freedom of speech is a right owned by each person individually, just by virtue of being human. This is the notion that I mentioned at the start, the notion of rights as personal assets, as the ace in the deck, the lone gunslinger syndrome, where each individual can shoot down anyone who ventures onto his or her turf. The argument against that, the Beauharnais argument, the group libel argument, is that racist and sexist speech does not foster robust public debate because it chills that debate by intimidating a whole class of speakers, by effectively libeling them. This argument has been brought up, but it has not met with success in recent years. But there is wiggle room there. For there just are cases where the majority wishes to suppress what it regards as dangerous, and if the constitutional road is barred, the majority will usually find another route. When Commissioner McCaffrey was overruled in his efforts to prevent the Paris Theater from showing Rossellini's The Miracle, the New York City Fire Department found a different way to skin that troublesome cat. Suppose that The Birth of a Nation had been banned. Would that have been bad for art? The Birth of a Nation is widely regarded as one of the most important movies in the history of cinema. The Museum of Modern Art's founding film curator, Iris Barry, wrote in 1940, quote, "The Birth of a Nation established the motion picture once and for all as the most popular and persuasive of entertainments and compelled the acceptance of film as an art," end quote. Griffith's work changed the way movies were made and inspired filmmakers for 50 years. The Birth of a Nation was as technically innovative for its time as Citizen Kane was for its. It's sometimes said that The Birth of a Nation is also intellectually simple-minded, but this seems to me to be wrong. It's a story constructed around assumptions about race that we consider false, but given those assumptions, the treatment is intelligent and reasonably complex. The Birth of a Nation is at least as sophisticated intellectually as City Lights or Modern Times. On the other hand, was the court entirely wrong in 1915 when it described the movies as a business pure and simple? Dixon had written a book, he had written a play. Those were not, financially, undertakings beyond the scope of most human beings. But Dixon could not have made his story into a movie of the size and scope and power of The Birth of a Nation without the help of Harry Aiken and his $59,000. Aiken had no particular interest in the message of Dixon's story. He only wanted to make money, and he did. The Birth of a Nation grossed over $60 million. Same is true of Joseph Burston and The Miracle. No doubt Burston believed that movies are an art form deserving protection from censorship, but he had been in films long enough to know that controversy is good for business. He did not pursue his legal case simply out of loyalty to the idea of art. We don't have trouble regulating many consumer goods like soft drinks and antidepressants and cars. Is a big-budget commercial movie like a book or a newspaper editorial, or is it more like an advertisement or a soft drink? Many people who accept the regulation of campaign contributions based on size would not make the same distinction in the case of art and entertainment, even though a campaign contribution arguably is political speech. Was The Birth of a Nation bad for black people in America? I think there is no doubt that it was. It's the most popular silent film ever made. In the first 11 years after its release, between 1915 and 1926, it was seen by more than 100 million people. Dixon once said, "Every man who comes out of our theaters is a Southern partisan for life." It might be objected that one cannot prove that The Birth of a Nation was the cause of the suffering or death of African Americans, but one cannot prove that the history of cinema would have been different without The Birth of a Nation either. The one claim seems as plausible as the other. And which is more important? Black people did suffer. Some black people were probably murdered as a consequence of Griffith's movie and the racist passions it educated and inflamed. Was it wrong to try to suppress it? Thank you.
This program was sponsored by the Jessie and John Danz Fund. Since 1962, these lectures have been a forum for distinguished scholars of national and international reputation who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe.